I want to first of all investigate some of the history behind the willingness of other states to support the Jewish claim to a homeland in the Middle East, because I think that's quite interesting. And then I want to speak more about the Abraham Accords, which you discussed. So one of the things that fascinates me, well, historically, but also in your book, is your discussion of the Balfour Declaration. And so that's obviously before the utter catastrophe of the Holocaust and the catastrophes the Jewish people ran into in the middle of the 20th century. By the time of the Balfour Declaration, there was some sense, at least in Great Britain, that the claim that Herzl had put forward, for example, that the Jews and the world would benefit from a Jewish homeland in the Middle East, had some validity. So why do you think that developed? And then how do you think it extended? Because you got bipartisan support for the notion of a Jewish homeland from the Americans by 1944. And then, of course, there was the UN 1947 Declaration. So it's not as if the Jews imposed this vision on the Middle East by themselves. There was support all over the world. And so could you walk us through how that support developed, and why you think it developed?
Yeah, it developed because in certainly in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, there was the propaganda that I've described, rewriting history, had not taken root. And most educated people knew the history of the Bible, the history of the Jewish people, their dispossession, what they thought were the horrors that the Jews suffered in their exile and dispersion, which was nothing compared to what was going to come later in the Holocaust. But that was enough for them. And they basically knew that the land was practically empty, and that, there were people there, but it was practically empty. And it made sense that both from a biblical prognostication for those who had a religious orientation, and also a humanist view, that this evil of history, this injustice of history, would be corrected, that this long-suffering people, the Jews, who contributed so much to civilization and to history, and to morality, the idea of morality, it's the Ten Commandments, that became the code, the moral code of the world, and so many other things, the birth of Christianity, many of the ideas, the moral ideas that we have, originated on these hills where I'm sitting in right now, this tiny, dusty edge of Asia, where this tribe, strange tribe, lived here and talked about, the fact that people should not remain slaves, that there should be a law that applies to all of them, that kings are not divine, that they're subject to moral authority and censure and all sorts of other crazy ideas like that. It's all originated here. And so the educated leaders that met in World War I after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they had to decide, who gets what. And they came upon the idea of self-determination, that is, that people should have, the ability to govern their nations, obviously with civic rights for other peoples living in their midst. And they concluded, knowing the history that I just described, that is so unknown today on college campuses and among so-called intellectuals who are anything but that, that the Jews deserved this right to rebuild their national life and their ancestral homeland. And that's how it developed. But the first one to actually bring it forward, you mentioned in the beginning of your comments, was Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was a giant of history. He was a journalist. He was a Jewish journalist in the late 19th century. He was born in Hungary, but worked for a very prestigious paper in Vienna. When he was dispatched to Paris as a correspondent, he saw the infamous Dreyfus trial, where a Jewish officer in the French army was falsely accused, as it later turned out, of espionage and betrayal, and was sentenced to Devil's Island and other horrible things. And he said this: if this can happen to the Jews in the apex of Western civilization, then it could happen anywhere. And he predicted that within a few decades, the fires of anti-Semitism would consume the Jews of Europe, that they would be slaughtered. He actually saw that. He wrote these things in 1900 roughly and before. And of course, the Holocaust came less than half a century later. And he said there's only one solution for this. The solution is to have the Jews, the solution is not going to be to integrate the Jews in societies, because that's not going to work. The solution would not be to eliminate nationalism through communism and other cosmopolitan internationalism. That's not going to work either. And in fact, he was right, because so much of anti-Semitism came from Stalinism and so on. Okay? It's not merely Nazism, it's Stalinism too. So either thing, it's not going to work. He said there's only one solution. The Jews should have a nation of their own, that is, a country of their own. And he sought to persuade first the German Kaiser, and after that the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, to give the Jews a state of their own, and he didn't succeed. He died after 8 years, that's it, 8 years. But in these 8 years, he launched this movement that turned the dream of ages, century after century, next year in Jerusalem. He turned it from a prayer, from a dream, into a practical plan. My grandfather, Nathan Milikovsky Netanyahu, he was enthralled by Herzl. He became a tremendous speaker at the age of 20. Thousands of people crowded to hear him throughout Europe, Eastern Europe, Poland. There were records, press records, which I give there, how people fought each other. They broke windows. They fought physically to hear this young man speak about about Herzl's vision, coming back to the Jewish homeland. Well, Herzl died. He died too early. And his followers continued the dream even though he was dead. My grandfather was one of them. My father was one of them. But they didn't succeed. So now we fast forward. In 1917, they succeed partly because the British Empire, which now, after the defeat of the Ottomans, controlled what is now the land of Israel, decided to give the Jews a homeland. They didn't say it's state yet, but they said a homeland. It was clear it was a corridor to a state. This was met by fervent Arab opposition by many of the Arabs who had immigrated to Israel, to what is now the land of Israel. They said, no, stop, you can't come anymore. Okay? They decided, we're just going to oppose any Jewish land. And the British backed down. They backed down from the so-called promise they gave. It's called the Balfour Declaration, where they promised the Jewish homeland. They backed off. Okay? And now the Jews are stuck. They're in Europe. They can't migrate because Jewish immigration was effectively blocked by the British, who betrayed their promises to the Jewish people. And now Hitlerism rises. 1933, Hitler rises to power. My father, who later became a great historian of the Jewish people, he's all of 23 years old. And here's what he writes with the rise of Hitler. He says, Hitlerism will annihilate all the Jews of Europe, and it's racial anti-Semitism that would consume every last Jew. And the only way we can fight it is to persuade the civilized world that it is not only the Jews who will be annihilated or threatened, it's their civilization too. This young Benzion Netanyahu, 23 years old, writes in 1933, if more people had heeded what he wrote, then perhaps we would have avoided a tremendous catastrophe that occurred to my people, but also to the 60 million who lost their lives in World War II. Well, they didn't. Now, my father saw this coming, and a few years later, he went to the United States in World War II, and he sought to recruit American public opinion. He's a young man in his early 30s. He's trying to recruit American public opinion to recognize that it's not merely for the sake of justice, doing justice with the Jews who are being incinerated in Europe. It's for American interest and Western interest to have a strong Jewish state, a strong Jewish state. And finally, he makes his way up the ladder because one official hears him, brings him to another, because he argued something that no Jew had argued before, no Zionist leader argued before. They all argued the moral case, which we've been discussing at some length in this program. But my father, he didn't he didn't abandon the moral case. He argued it with great passion. But he turned, when he talked to statesmen, as he taught me, when you talk to public opinion, you talk about justice. And you have to argue the justice of your cause. That those who are unjust do the same, so you may as well do it to protect yourself against the people who lie, the people who cheat, or present themselves as moralists while they blow up babies deliberately, okay? Speak of human rights while they trample human rights. You have to argue justice and speak the truth. But when you speak to statesmen, as my father told me, you have to tell them, you have to speak of interest. That is what my father did. Mm-hmm. And at the end of World War II...
Well, that seems to be what you did with the Abraham Accords.
Exactly right.
That by allowing or by facilitating Israel's development into an economic powerhouse,
exactly right.
You also made the country, you helped build the country into something that could be practically allied with, as well as, let's say, making them simultaneous moral
exactly.
case.
And that's really... You hit exactly on the vision, because my purpose in life, inherited from my grandfather and from my father and my fallen brother, my brother who fell while leading the most celebrated rescue mission in modern times, the historic rescue of Entebbe, where he died. I described that moment when I learned about it in some detail, and also what happened there, which is not fully known. But I inherited from them a life of purpose. And the purpose was to assure the prosperity, security, and permanence of the Jewish state, insofar as you can offer anything permanent in our world. And to do that, I realized that Israel had to be not only to fend off the false claims that try to deny its legitimacy as a state and our historic rights and our ancient homeland, but quite separate or complementing that is to make Israel very powerful, because history is very unkind.
And productive, not just powerful, right? Because the other advantage you had with the Abraham Accords was that you could present Israel as a compelling partner in economic development to Arab states that were actually hungry for a pathway forward out of their unidimensional dependence on oil wealth, for example.
Exactly right. When I say powerful, I don't mean militarily powerful, and that's exactly what I point out in the book. And I said, normally, if you ask Israelis before that, what is powerful? Well, powerful means having a strong army. I concluded very early on, having served in the army, I served in a special unit, an elite unit, and I described my brushes with death and clandestine missions and far into beyond the lines of enemy lines, and many firefights that I was in. In one, I nearly drowned in the Suez Canal. In one, I was shot while rescuing, while taking part in a rescue of hostages in a hijacked plane, and so on. So I had intimacy with the military, obviously, because I also served for 5 years in this special unit as a soldier and officer. And it's a big adventure story, as you must have read. But I understood early on that to have military power, you have to pay for all these things. You have to pay for F-35 aircrafts. You have to pay for submarines, for tanks, for drones, for cyber, for intelligence, all very expensive. How are you going to pay for it? Oh, well, in Israel, semi-socialist Israel that I grew up in, it's very obvious. You tax the rich. Well, the problem with that is you don't have enough rich people, and they're all going to leave to other places with lower taxes. So I figured that the way you can actually enable Israel to be strong militarily is you have to make it strong economically. But to make it strong economically, you have to completely overhaul Israel's economic system from semi-socialism to free market capitalism. And I entered public life essentially with that view. And I became first prime minister, then finance minister, and again prime minister. And I led a free market revolution that turned Israel from basically a supplicant to one of the most advanced economies on earth. Just to give you an example, when I was first elected prime minister, Israel was well behind all the Western European economies, certainly the United States and Canada, in terms of per capita income. Well, as a result of the changes that I put forward and I described in the book, Israel became, in per capita income, wealthier than Japan, France, Britain, Germany. It's actually outstripped them all. And the power, my vision was that the fusion of free markets and technology, which we invest in all the time in our military, that produces this tremendous efflorescence, economic efflorescence, and that gives you the power combination. The power combination is not merely the military, which you can now afford. It's the civilian technology which you now develop. And so Arab states could see, well,